My name is Nichols, and the work that I'll be presenting is collaborative in many different senses. The particular part of work package 6 for this big grant project that I'll be presenting, I called High Gods, Low Gods, and Morality in Ancient China. And I'm emphasizing some new methods for people in the humanities to begin using if they're interested in applying certain scientific methods to what they do. I'll try to establish that, and we'll also discuss a few results. But first, I wanted to introduce you briefly to the full breadth of the work package, which includes collaboration with Julie Qi and Hongfu Gang from Beijing universities, and not Beijing University, Cass and Beihang, and Ted Slingerland from UBC, and a couple of people who helped write some Python codes for us to do this work. The work package 6 is devoted to moral and historical issues having to do with Chinese religion. And the first component is an interdisciplinary explanation or exploration of certain effects of Confucianism. So here, one of the noteworthy things about Confucianism in ancient China is that it ends up having lots of behavioral effects and institutional effects on subsequent Chinese culture. Those in turn affect people even today, or at least that's the argument of this component of our work package. So we're trying to show there that Confucianism, in particular filial piety, Xiao, ends up overriding features of what we're calling naturalness, features of our bio program. And that we regard as very interesting. So in addition to identifying ways that people across cultures are very similar, we're also interested in not reducing those similarities to nothing. And Xiao is one example. So that's the first component. The second component to the work package is experimental. And here we've done some, we have lots of data now about under priming conditions and non-priming conditions, where we talk about filial piety, or we talk about religion, or control conditions. And we ask them questions like, how willing would you be to lie in a courtroom as you testify if your father has, say, been driving in a car that you were in and damages someone else's property? How willing are you to lie to the police? You can see the distribution here is an indication that there are some significant differences. So the main goal, though, today is to focus on the third component of this work package, and that's a quantitative analysis of texts. So here, I wanted to note 3 assumptions before I move forward. The first is that the methods that we're using are immersively interdisciplinary. So what I mean by that is, in part, well, mostly, often at least, cognitive science of religion partners with certain other theories like evolutionary psychology to get things done. We find deeper explanations when we combine certain parts of psychology with others. But there's a component here where we can add in things from history and philosophy and religion, which might be of interest to you. Oftentimes, the scientists can tell humanities people what's happening, but this is a case in which some in-depth knowledge from these specialty subjects can illuminate certain results from the quantitative analysis of texts. The second working assumption here is that early China had lots of cooperation. Early China had monumental architecture, which is often a sign of large-scale cooperation. It developed agriculture very, very early, had all kinds of civil institutions. When writing this, I realized that the best example of monumental architecture in early China is probably in Xi'an, and it's not exactly an example of cooperation, if you see what I mean. But still, it was huge. Last assumption here, the goal is to test hypotheses in cognitive science of religion, but also look at, or if not test, at least explore humanists' theories and their interpretations of early Chinese religion. I'll try to make very explicit to you how I think that our project here can do both of those things. So one of the questions here, how are high gods, however you want to translate that, associated with punishment and prosociality? Prosociality meaning something like cooperation. Okay, why care? Well, one of the reasons to care about the role of religion in ancient China has to do with the nature of the development of civil societies. We know from cognitive science of religion, anthropology, and other psychological and social sciences that societies grow and flourish when there are certain mechanisms in those societies to keep people honest. Right? One of the biggest and most important is punishment, mechanisms of punishment. However, while punishment brings lots of benefits to a group, when people are willing to punish deserters or defectors or cheaters, punishment brings lots of benefits to the group. However, punishment has many costs, and early societies often find it difficult to understand how to leverage punishment without paying too high a cost for the benefits. Some of the costs involve you need to find and identify cheaters. You need to often allocate resources to others, like police, to do the business for you. One of the problems here is that I'm sure this never happens in China, but every American cop show is about how cops are corrupt. It's no coincidence that policemen are often accused of being corrupt, in part because they are the second order punishers. They're supposed to keep other people honest, which immunizes them from certain threats of punishment themselves. As cheaters become more sophisticated, punishment becomes more sophisticated and more costly, and it's very vulnerable to second order cheating. So if you're Confucius, and you're, say, writing Analect's book 2, how do you want to organize society? You're coming out of the Warring States period. Some research shows that there are about 234 different civil conflicts in the Warring States period. And in Analect's chapter 2, Confucius says, you know what, we can use punishment, but there are better ways to motivate society. In part, I think he had in mind some of the costs of punishment. He says there, if you rule a society by punishment, you're encouraging people to find ways around the law. But if you rule a society by something like shame, you'll have extra benefits. So on the basis of some of the theory represented in this slide, we come to this concept of a high god. So some researchers in cognitive science of religion at University of British Columbia have devoted some effort to characterizing what a high god is. How does that differ from a low god? There are 3 major components to a high god listed here. The first, a high god cares about human cooperation and harmony, you might think, morality. The second, the high god enforces norms, or is thought to enforce norms of society, whether with punishment or with reward. And last, the high god monitors human behavior. Now, if you're familiar a little bit with Western philosophy, you may have heard of the Western philosophy of religion, that is, you may have heard of the term, the god of the philosophers. Well, typically that refers to a god who is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. That's just the kind of god, that's sort of the perfect recipe for a high god. If you have only 1 or 2 of these things, but not 3, your status as a high god will be a bit less. And in psychological experiments, we've shown, or the research team I'm a part of, before I got up there, they showed through several experiments, priming people with high god concepts leads to different outcomes in prosocial behavior. When you prime people with a high god concept, all of a sudden they get more generous. These are results from certain economic games, and the team has used a different set of economic games for different experiments. But when you prime people with a high god, they're more generous to partners. If there's no prime, they're not as generous. What this shows, this confirms some of the CSR theory that I just mentioned. When priming people with high gods, it increases people's beneficial behavior to others, prosocial, cooperative behavior. So, in addition to laboratory experiments, some really genius, creative researchers have spent the time necessary to get to know some databases. Databases collected by field anthropologists, often from years and years ago, very carefully manicured databases of responses from people in all kinds of far-flung places of the world. So when looking at these databases, there's lots of coding in how people charted the behaviors and beliefs of these different groups. And when Johnson and Rosen Raymond looked it through, they found some really interesting things about high gods. They found that in the subset of cultures in these databases that have high gods, those groups are more cooperative, they reduce internal conflict, there's less in-group fighting, they improve the ability of a group to make war, that's another benefit of high gods, or cost if you want to put it like that, and many more. So the overall point here is that high gods in anthropological studies, data-driven studies, also lead to cooperation. So in addition to economic games, lots of other psychologists have explored this in many other ways. So whether, previous speakers have mentioned some of this research already, so I suppose I don't need to get into that. So I'll move on. When approaching our specific goals for component 3 of this work package, we wanted to be clear about what our hypotheses were going into this project. we're treating our study of texts, in other words, as a scientist might treat a body of data that he or she's about to collect. So we had three main hypotheses. High God terms will be co-locating in our big set of texts with terms for things like punishment at a rate that's higher than deity words will co-locate with things like punishment. Second hypothesis is the same as H1, except here we're replacing reward with punishment. And in the third, we look, instead of just at punishment and reward, we look more broadly at morality. Now, if you caught what I was saying earlier about the definition of high gods, the very first thing, the very first trait of a high god is that a high god cares about morality, human behavior, right? And we're just getting started with the use of this data set, and this is the specific component that we're most interested in looking at. If we find that certain gods don't care about human morality, then we can discard those as not being high gods. So at this point, I'd like to try to explain the interface between what we're trying to do in this work package and what humanities scholars do. Now, if you're a student of ancient Chinese philosophy and religion, you've probably read some articles dealing with answers to questions like, does early China have high gods? What's the relationship between supernatural agents and morality? What are the differences between some of the major candidates for high godship in early China? And how might those differences change over time? And we feel as though we can more or less answer those questions. Now, our answers may not be certain, but we're just aiming to increase the probability of plausible answers here. It turns out that we're not the first people to pose these questions, of course, and many other people do. Among them are two of the most famous Western historians of Chinese philosophy, Roger Ames and David Hall, who've collaborated many times and written several books together. These two have a little quote that people in China believe that when Westerners talk about Western gods, they see a duck, and people in the West believe that when people in China talk about their gods, they see a rabbit. We reconfirm what we think the other people believe about God. We reconfirm what we believe about God by describing other people as having the same beliefs as we. That's the perspective of these very major philosophers of ancient China. However, they emphasize that, they think that's generally true. They emphasize this role in religion, and it leads to questions about what ancient Chinese high gods are. According to Roger Ames and David Hall and many other scholars, China has no high gods. Ancient China does not have high gods. That is, ancient China doesn't have supernatural agencies that are caring about human morality, that are powerful, and that take an interest in punishing, have the ability to do that. This is in part because the origins of high gods in ancient China are thought to be either in, say, divination or shamanism, or maybe ancestor reference. Okay? Numbers of scholars have described these sorts of origins, and typically you don't get those three major outcomes, especially the last one about knowing lots and lots of information from these sources. However, contrary to that humanities interpretation of the early Chinese record, some people, including Justin Barrett, have emphasized the naturalness of religion, the cross-cultural invariance of certain features of religion. That's why he uses the term pan-cultural. Okay? So the research question here is, are Ames and Hall correct that there is no high god in ancient China, or do pan-cultural naturalness theories win the day? Now, before we move on to looking at our data, I really wanted to explain just a little bit about what this controversy is, in case some of you are psychologists and don't know much about how these concepts are described in early China. So let's take a brief look at the major god concepts, the major candidates for high gods. So Tian is thought by Ames and Hall to be a non-personal force. They also describe Tian as a designation for a regular pattern. Now, the important thing to notice about this in cognitive science terms is that if something is a force or it's a regular pattern, it doesn't have a mind. Okay? If it doesn't have a mind, it's not going to care much about human morality. Other people put this in even more pointed language. Journet says that the idea of a personal God in Christianity is countered by the Chinese idea of an impersonal heaven, Tian. Some people translate Tian as God, some people translate that as heaven. There are some significant differences, though, with the other major high god concepts in early China, Di and Shangdi. So some people say that Di does appear to care a bit about human morality and gives disasters and rewards to certain people. Others say that it's these are anthropomorphic. I refer to the work of David Keeley, the famous historian from California. But on the other hand, other people say that D is transcendent and supremely powerful. And yet another batch of research that's more recent and fascinating, by the way, the work of Sarah Allen, she's looking often at the earliest texts, including oracle bones and other documents shortly thereafter, finding that D is a very impersonal thing. It's actually the pole star, or as one other person calls it, the pivot of the heavens. So when we look at other texts, like the Analects, we find very equivocal remarks. Does Confucius think that Tien is a high god or not? Well, if I've said or done anything wrong, may heaven forsake me. Notice the implication of this, or the suggestion here, is that heaven is capable of forsaking him. Heaven might have a mind if heaven is going to forsake someone, punish someone. On the other hand, does heaven say anything? The four seasons run their course, and all things are produced. Right? In this case, this is much more in line with the Hall and Ames version, but you know what? This doesn't seem to be in line. We don't know. One of the difficulties methodologically here, as a humanities person myself, I forgot to mention that I am in the humanities. I'm in a department of philosophy, just barely. Now, I don't think they won't be back. Honestly, they might not want me back. But what's frustrating as a historian of philosophy is that people use close reading methods. Some people will go to this text and say, oh wow, this is just fascinating. This is the real meaning of the Analects. And other people will say, go down to 1719 and say, no, this is what Confucius really means. In the end, you have dueling close readings, dueling passages, debates that can last, a century. So we wanted to do something a little bit different, and that's why we use new methods. We're using new methods, brand new scientific methods, okay? You can see the archaic route out there. We're using things like corpus linguistics and quantitative approaches to words. Right? And that, we hope, is going to give us answers to some of our research questions that we haven't been able to get so far. So the world of corpus linguistics, broadly speaking, has interfaced very well with psychology. One of the most interesting, fascinating researchers is this guy called Jamie Pennebaker in psychology from Texas. And he's done lots to show that words are very predictive of mental states. One of the worst things he found, well, one of the most interesting things is the more people use first person personal pronouns, the more likely they are to be depressed. So once you read papers like that, that's when you go through your email inbox and start using the software to count up all the first person pronouns you use. Which is, unfortunately, by the way, if you're interested in a research project, somebody needs to work on Chinese versions of Luke. It's done. There is a Chinese version of this software. However, what about pronoun drop in Chinese? We can say sentences without using wo. We just go right into the verb. Well, in those cases, does that affect this mental health outcome? Some other research is very important for what we're doing here. Edward Slanlin, he's done a lot to study quantitatively, in part study ancient China with science in mind. There are a number of other really neat studies, but we'll forego those to talk about the data set. So according to the ARC data, we have about 5.7 million characters in our database that cover 96 texts from pre-Qin, Han, and post-Han periods. We've done lots of post-processing, but I won't bore you with some of those details. It's important to package this right when you start running software tools on it. We also coded in lots and lots of metadata. So we have dates for everything. We coded with eras. We identify the schools or the genres that the literature comes from, and we're able to do all kinds of testing. So with my boss, Edward Slangerland, we're doing some studies about Xin. That's his favorite theme, the heart-mind. Is it a body? Is it a part of the body? Is it a soul? What is it? Again, you have dueling close readings, so we're trying to get clear on that. But we're also using this to study high gods. So to avoid bias, what we wanted to do was find someone else's definitions of high gods. We didn't want to say, oh, these are the high gods, so these are the ones that we're going to study. Thankfully, there's someone called Christoph Harzmeyer at University of Heidelberg in Germany. He and some colleagues from mainland China and from Hong Kong and from Taiwan all got together and created this thing called the Thesaurus Linguae Sericae. This is what he calls a cognitive map of ancient China. So he and his friends got together and coded lots and lots and lots of these terms, and he outputs what he calls synonym groups and many other things. So this is a screenshot of what it looks like, and that's his name if you want to search it on Google. So here we use the synonym groups from Harbsmeyer having to do with high gods and low gods. That's what we use to do our testing. That way, we're not approaching it with the answers. We're trying to use somebody else's coding to get at this. So we use his coding for high gods and deities, but also for punishment and reward. Deities there is a proxy for low gods, like ghosts and spirits and things like that. We found some problems with this. So for example, Jian, that's a very interesting character, isn't it? 3 women together. So this one is sometimes used as a spirit and sometimes used to refer to evil. Okay, a certain type of evil. And according to this system, thank you. Sorry, I have 10 minutes left. That's all. But yes, anyway. According to the TLS system, this is actually a spirit rather than some moral term. This was a problem with us because it's very infrequently used as a spirit, but the TLS codes so that if something is ever used as a spirit, it's thrown into the deities section with the ghosts and the spirits and stuff. That's why we at University of British Columbia last year we created our own coded list and had experts walk through several different concepts: morality, emotion, religion, and cognition. So in addition to the results that I'm presenting now, we can also look at which deities and which supernatural agents are the most or the least cognitive, and within that, we can look at how the different deities are being portrayed as more or less cognitive. So here's an example of these are the lists of the TLS categories we were using. Here's some of what our data looks like, just descriptively speaking. It's divided into certain genres or schools. We have totals for characters, and we also took totals for each of the god, deity, punishment, and reward tokens that appear in the text. Okay? Here's our totals overall for everything for the entire corpus down there. And like I mentioned, we have dates coded in there. That was a bit too fine-grained for our analyses. Besides who can date a Chinese text, it's hard to know exactly when they were written as opposed to when they were redacted and edited. So we coded in eras and so on. Now, do you remember my hypotheses at this point? I've been going on a while now. So the hypotheses are that more or less high god terms, as coded by the TLS system, high god terms will have closer associations with certain moral concepts than will low god or deity terms. Those are our main hypotheses. So we did some tests, some pretty simple chi-square tests. They're simple in theory. They're a little hard to do, but we looked at the relationship between deities, our low god category, and high gods, and tried to find differences between observed values and expected values. So here we're using a method in corpus linguistics known as collocation. So we identify all the different deity words, some 35,000 or so, depending on how you count, and we find out whether or not they are co-located with certain concepts for reward, punishment, and such. That's the underlying principle that we're using. And this is our hypothesis. So you can read this pretty simply. We have, so the observed is over here, the expected is over here. And it turns out that when high god and punishment terms are co-located in our large corpus, we find that high gods are observed at a higher rate in these co-locations than we expect to see them. That's an interesting result for us because that's confirmatory of our hypothesis. We're showing that the deities, according to the TLS category, the deities have a reduced relationship to concepts of punishment, and high gods, as consistent with the CSR hypothesis here, high gods have a closer relationship with punishment terms. So for hypothesis 2, we switch out punishment and talk about reward. And here you can see that the differences, the observed frequency, 992, the expected, 940. So we see a slight but still pretty significant difference there. High gods are overrepresented in relationship to reward terms, and deities, you see the opposite effect. You see a lower number here and a higher number there. Okay? So that also confirms this hypothesis H2. So lastly, we applied our different morality list. This one is cleaned up a little bit, and we reduce its size. And here we're saying that high gods co-locate with morality at a higher rate. And lo and behold, we find a similar relationship. Observed frequency is higher than what we expect. So high gods are overrepresented in relationship to moral terms. Now, it turns out that in addition to the Sharif and Nor and Zion results I showed you, they had another condition. They had a secular authority prime. In their secular authority prime, they instead of using God concepts, they describe features of the government of Canada. And it turns out that when you do that, you also get a really big benefit to pro-sociality. People were more willing to give money in these economic games. So this raises another question. What if ancient China, instead of having, we've shown now that there are certain gods that are much more closely associated with morality concepts than others, but we wanted to make sure that they weren't secular authorities there doing the work. So this is why we asked this research question: is it stronger than the relationship between secular authority figures and punishment? Well, here we chose two people that we regarded as paragons of civil authority in ancient China, the two sage kings that Confucius is always talking about, Shen and Yao. So there we did the same thing with a slightly different hypothesis, the sage kings, and lo and behold, we can see that the sage kings, these two characters, are overrepresented relative to punishment words than our high gods. So our observed frequency of high gods is less than our expected frequency, but the observed frequency for sage king and punishment collocations is significantly higher than the expected frequency. It turns out that these two sage kings are very associated with concepts of morality and punishment. Now, this seems to be disconfirmatory of our hypothesis, and I mean, technically it is, but it occurred to me after doing this that who are the sage kings? When you think about who they are, they're quasi-mythical people, basically. They might have been humans at one time, but maybe they were never human. Right? As a result, this might not be the best way to approach this kind of control condition. So we're having to think about how to design this, and we're not yet sure how to get some control conditions there. We did the same thing with reward, and we found there that sage kings were not as associated with reward as were high gods, so that did confirm the hypothesis. With the 2 minutes or 3 minutes I have left, I just wanted to introduce the last component. This is the most exploratory, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but on the other hand, I find the humanities audiences really enjoy this topic modeling process. So we have the close reading. So for all of our data, we can zoom right in on all the occurrences of Shen and Gui and look at what line by line, what the context is here. But we want to find that we still want to use bigger picture data analysis and data mining to get at some of these relationships. So we turn to topic modeling. Topic modeling is a generative, unsupervised method of studying latent patterns in natural language. I can explain this in more detail in the Q&A if you'd like, but I just wanted to show you briefly what it does. So this is an algorithm that shows you which sets of terms a given term travels in throughout the entire corpus. And every topic model ends up outputting four different files for us of data. So there's lots and lots of potential here. We can identify the most religious topics, and when we find Tian or Di or even Shen or Gui, we can see which other characters they're traveling with throughout the corpus. We can split this to see which text has the most emphasis on moral connections between Tian and Di, if we like. We can also look at the word weights of individual characters across both the corpus and the text. There's a lot of versatility here. So what it can do is help us draw some inferences about naturalness, about these CSR times. So very briefly, this is the most important topic in all of ancient Chinese thought. Right? This right here. You can see in this it's most important because this appears in more documents in our sample than anything else, and it represents Tian as the second most highest weighted character. What's on top, of course, Ren. So Tian, Xia, Wen, and Zhi, so know, knowledge. A lot of these ingredients are very relevant for CSR. We see characters for morality, both good and evil, characters for mental states, and so on. So this is really interesting, and it loads in all kinds of texts across all kinds of genres. So, to summarize, sinologists like Ames and Hall have emphasized the differences between what they call the Chinese mind and other minds, but CSR emphasizes some of the similarity between different cultures. Ames and Hall put special emphasis on the role that Chinese religion has by virtue of the absence of high gods. But what our data is showing is that there's a very significant reason to think that the probability ancient China has high gods is actually much higher than Ames and Hall and other humanists had thought. So our tentative conclusion accords with naturalness theory and Finnish cultural trends. There is a subset of Chinese gods, deities, supernatural agencies that are very closely associated with those magical three characteristics that lead to high gods. There's much more work to be done to continue to do some of this. We can look at, say, variance of punishment and collocation rates by genre if we want. We can do close readings and much more. That's ongoing. So I conclude by just thanking all the different groups of people that have helped us. Templeton World Charity Foundation for making this possible, my university, the University of British Columbia, where I was at for a while, and the Thrive Center, Fuller Theological, and Justin Luna and Chen Feng Hao. And thank you for your attention too.